We need to use this time to think. We're not going back. But where are we going? What do we want for our planet, our communities, our future? If we don't answer this question, it will be answered for us, and blame shifted from the powerful to the powerless. We need each other now. We need to reflect and reset, strategize, organize, assemble, collective power. This is a network. Join, claim the future. Welcome, everybody. People will have seen that video at a number of our events in recent months, but let me just explain to people who may not have been to a Claim the Future online event what we're about. Very, very briefly, a number of months ago, it was at the beginning really of when the pandemic was hitting and we were going into our first lockdown. We were, I suppose, trying to bring people together to talk about the issues that we were facing as a community, and then also the issues that we would face as we went through the pandemic, and also the lessons that we'd learned as a result of 10 years of austerity. And the objective was, let's try and just network people, not to set up a new organization. We've got enough organizations on the left, but let's try and network people in a discussion of bringing together policy experts and campaigners on the ground to talk about, how do we tackle the immediate issues, but also really echoing what went on with the last but one major paradigm shift after the Second World War, which was those people I said it then, in the depths of the war. They were looking back on the 1930s and saying never again, but at the same time, they were dreaming, hoping, planning for the world after the war, the sort of world they wanted to construct. And we thought that's the sort of thing progressives should be doing now, which is dealing with the immediate issues, talking about the policies that we need, but also the campaigns that we need, and backing up the campaigners that are already campaigning on these issues, with solid policy research as well, and supporting the work on the ground, but also talking about the sort of society we want to construct as we move out of the pandemic. And overlaying all of that, obviously, was the discussion about the next crisis, which is the existential threat of climate catastrophe. So we brought people together. Many of you will have been involved in some of these discussions. We held a series of panel discussions, issue by issue, and then brought together in one conference, an online conference, all those panels, and we published a series of the papers, and then we published a summary booklet, which again brought together a number of those ideas about the immediacy of some of these issues. What I give a good example. The good example was what was happening with regard to housing and the rented section within our community, and the campaigns that were going on against landlordism, against the increase in rents, the evictions, etc. So supporting the renters union and Acorn and others, but then looking at the long-term housing policy that we want. So it's that sort of example that we're doing in a whole series of fields as well. One of the issues that came up from the start, really, or at the very early stages of the pandemic, we realized that we'd had 10 years of austerity, and actually people's incomes, in many respects, their wages were still below the levels they were before the banking crash in 2008. There've been pay freezes, pay cuts, unemployment at running quite a serious level as well, and casualisation and privatisation, which had forced down wages too, forcing people into quite a precarious existence, particularly as a result of casualisation and privatisation and outsourcing. And as a result of that, many of them in debt just to get by. And the levels of personal debt were increasing year by year and putting an immense amount of pressure on people. And it was adding to, quite interesting in the discussions that were taking place, it was adding to the levels of stress and actually the high levels of suicide as well, tragically. So the debt discussion became quite an important part of the work that we were doing about how do we tackle it now, And then also, how do you create a society that isn't dependent on debt in this way? What we're doing today is just because I think it's going to be one of the most central issues that we have to deal with in the coming months, and one in which I actually think we can mobilize a campaign that can have a significant breakthrough. We thought we'd bring together today a few people who've been working on this issue for quite a while. Tragically for me and for many of us, there's an empty seat at the table as well, which is David Graeber, who tragically died a few weeks ago. He was a very good friend to most of us, all of us who knew him. He was a good friend. He was that sort of person. And to those who didn't know him, he was just such a significant figure on raising the issue of debt. He did his book on debt, which is, I think, just a masterpiece. And actually, it's on the BBC have done a series of programs with David talking on debt. It's on BBC Sounds at the moment, if you want to listen to it. It's very much shadows the book and the arguments within the book around debt. And I just miss him. I wish he was here. But what we've got today is a panel of people who I think will not only be able to inform us about the debt issues that we face, but also, I think, help us in the discussion that we need to have about where we go to next, both in terms of policy, how do we develop them, how do we tackle debt, but also, as I say, how do we mobilize a campaign in the coming months? Because that's what I'd like us to do. We've got to tackle this issue of debt before actually more people are in real hardship and poverty, and also, as I say, because of the mental health implications of the debt burden that people are undertaking, experiencing at the moment. So let's kick off. I get told off because I'm useless as chair, because I get carried away and interested with what everybody's speaking, and we go on for ages. So the reason is because we have such good speakers, really. We have such good contributors to these discussions. Our first speaker is Gemma Byrne. Let me just read through the bio, because again, I find this, we've been able to bring together some real expertise and also the sort of the new generations of thinkers around these issues, and Gemma's one of them. She's a senior policy researcher at Citizens Advice Bureau. Remember what the CAP does in all our communities. It supports millions of people every year on providing advice on everything from consumer rights to housing, pensions, you name it, but also on debt itself. And Gemma is well placed to help us understand the sort of the horrifying scale of debt in this country and the appalling effect it's having on people's lives and health. And she'll be using a presentation as well. So over to you, Gemma.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah, I think the slides should hopefully come off in a second. Okay, perfect, thank you. So as John said, I'm Gemma. I'm a senior policy researcher from Citizens Advice. And for anyone who doesn't know Citizens Advice, we're a network of charities that provide free, impartial advice to anyone who needs it, whatever their problem is. And debt has always been one of the biggest issues that we advise on, and that's become even more important when the pandemic hit. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Thanks. So we all know that coronavirus and the associated lockdowns have had a significant financial impact on a huge number of people, whether it's because they were made redundant or furloughed, or they had their hours reduced, or perhaps they had to take time off to care for someone. But what it's meant is that people have really struggled to pay their bills. And at Citizens Advice, we estimate that about 6 million people are behind on their bills because of the pandemic. So that estimate actually comes from a survey that we ran in July. So I think it's probably quite likely that that number has now increased. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the people affected, we've been labelling this an unequal crisis. And that's because across the various types of impact that coronavirus has had on people's lives, it's disproportionately affected certain groups of people. And this is no different when it comes to debt. So what this graph shows is that 11% of the UK population has fallen behind on its bills because of coronavirus, and that's represented by the pink line. And then the blue bars represent the percentage of people in various different groups that have fallen behind on their bills. And what stands out the most is that insecure workers are far more likely to have fallen behind on their bills than the average person in the UK. But also people from BAME communities, and particularly Black people, are much more affected. And then also, carers, disabled people, people who have been shielding, key workers, and under 30s. It's hit them more harshly than it has other people. And so it really is a kind of unequal crisis, as we call it. Next slide, please. So overall, we estimate that the value of these arrears is about 1.6 billion. And what we're most worried about at Citizens Advice is rent and council tax. And there are kind of two reasons for that. The first is that they are the areas with the greatest value of arrears, but also they are the bills for which there are the most severe consequences for non-payment. If we can go on to the next slide. So starting off with rent, we're seeing someone and helping them every 2 minutes with a private rented sector issue. And the graph here shows the number of clients that we've helped each month throughout the pandemic with private rented sector issues. And you can see that steadily increased throughout the pandemic. And the government has placed a ban on eviction enforcement until the 11th of January. But possession proceedings are still ongoing. So what that means is for people who were hit quite hard financially by the pandemic and the first lockdown, who might have had their, they might have been unable to pay their rent, and their landlord might have served them an eviction notice during the first lockdown. That notice might be coming to force in early January. And so basically what that means is that there'll be people facing the risk of eviction in January who've already had a difficult time in the first lockdown and are now just coming out of the second lockdown, where they've probably had another hit to their finances. And we heard from, the forecast and the spending review yesterday. It really, it doesn't look like the economy is going to miraculously recover anytime soon. So people are really going to struggle to pay back these arrears and are likely to see their rent arrears just kind of mounting up. And in fact, in Citizens Advice, for the people that we help with debt issues, on average, they have about £20 per month left over after covering their essential living costs that they could use to pay off any debts. And that's just, that's an average. We see a lot of people with what we call negative budgets, and that's where the income they have coming in each month isn't enough to cover their essential living costs, let alone repaying debt. So what we know from looking at that data about our clients that we help on debt is that for them, on average, it will take about 7 years to repay their rent arrears. So there's some clear signs that we're heading into a rent arrears crisis where people really will struggle to repay their arrears and will increasingly face eviction. If we could have the next slide, please. So then moving on to council tax, we estimate about 2.8 million people are behind on their council tax bills because of coronavirus. And what this graph shows is the views to our webpage called Dealing with Council Tax Arrears. So it's an advice page on our website. And what this shows is that at the beginning of the crisis, there was quite a sharp decline in the number of people viewing that page on our website. And that will be because of the protections that were in place. But from about May onwards, we can see more and more people coming to our website looking for help with dealing with council tax arrears, because they're increasingly worried about them and they're mounting up. If we have the next slide as well. And what's particularly concerning about council tax is the way that that debt escalates. So, for instance, 2 weeks after missing a council tax payment, people become liable for their entire annual bill. So, people will often also face court costs and bailiff fees. And what this means is that missing a single payment of £167 can quickly escalate to a debt of over £2,000 in just over 2 months. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we think there are long-term and short-term changes that are needed to tackle these huge debt issues. So in the long term, we want to see reform of the private rented sector, including the scrapping of Section 21 no-fault evictions and better enforcement of the rules in place to protect renters. We also want to see changes to debt collection rules, including the introduction of a bailiff regulator to ensure that bailiffs are following the rules and they are treating people in debt fairly. And then finally, we'd like to see reforms to council tax collection and, for example, making the rules more flexible so that councils don't have to make people liable for a whole year's worth of council tax when they miss just one payment. Next slide, please. And then finally, in the short term, we've been calling for greater hardship funding for local authorities so that they can help people in those areas to address their rent and council tax arrears that have been built up during the pandemic. And on council tax, it's certainly encouraging that yesterday in the spending review, the government announced funding for local authorities to be able to deal with some of the losses in income that have resulted from unrecoverable council tax payment failures. But what's really important is that that then translates into helping the individual households that at the moment have unmanageable levels of council tax debt. So it kind of feels like we're partway there, but it's really important that that actually translates to helping households. And then finally, on helping renters, we've still got a way to go. What we're calling for is a national programme of grants and interest-free government-backed loans to help people with rent arrears to pay back those arrears and ultimately to be able to stay in their homes. So I think that's everything that I have to say. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Gemma, thanks for that. Thanks a lot, Gemma. That's terrific. We'll come back to you in the questions and discussion because some of those issues about how we target support are going to be quite critical in this coming period. It's interesting. On the local authority stuff yesterday, I got the impression actually the local authority funding support was pretty poor. It was a pittance as such, and we've got some local authorities, as you know, that were near bankruptcy in the last few months as a result of the demands placed on them. And the COVID support that they've had from government has been pretty limited, and also has been like drawing teeth all the time when they establish new grant regimes, getting the money out from central government to local government and then out to individuals and communities has been pretty tough all the way through. It's a lesson for the future, definitely. Thanks, Gemma, for that. It's really, really good. We'll come back to you. Okay. Our next speaker, people will know, has been involved in the work. She was involved in the development of the debt paper that was published for Claim the Future, is John Montgomerie. John is, let me get her title right, I always get it wrong, she's the head of the Department of European International Studies at King's College London. And I'm really grateful, John, we've drawn upon you for some advice and about the practical actions that could be taken, both in terms of resolving debt here and also globally. Can I just give a plug for her book as well, Should We Abolish Debt? And in that she sets out her various. That's it. It's a plug because it's worth going into because it sets out all the arguments about how we tackle debt itself and the implications of debt, not just for individuals but for the economies overall. And one of the arguments that we've got to win this campaign on, I think. Johnna, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me again, John. I'm always very happy to hear and also be part of such a great panel. Astra Taylor, who goes next, has the latest book out on debt cancellation as well, which I'm sure she's going to tell us all about. But I think, what's really great going after the citizens' advice research and understanding the kind of deep context and ways in which debt is reaching down really into the intimacies of everyday life because of COVID, the way in which debt acts as an agent of misfortune in many people's life. It's not that people are poor and go into debt, it's that debt makes them poor and is what puts them in poverty, and the role that debt plays in many different parts of the suffering that's going on as a result of the pandemic and the economic harm that's being generated. And I speak here from South Croydon. Croydon Council has gone bankrupt, and in the midst of a pandemic, all around us, those that work at the council or have subsidiary services are facing redundancies and real hardship they feel, most people just feel lucky to have any work. So, we are really facing at this turning point with the spending review yesterday in the UK, but also with the election of President Biden in the United States. We really are at this moment of great change in which we're all waiting to find out how the recovery to COVID will unfold. Will it bring what it promised, or are we facing more of the same? And I want to take a step back from the point that's being made about citizens' advice, by citizens' advice about these sort of deep problems and how these are experienced on the everyday level, to talk in more general terms here as a political economist, to connect what's happening at the everyday level to these big important debates that are being had as Biden forms his economic policy in response to COVID, and as we heard yesterday in the UK spending review, is that money is politics, that it becomes clear in these moments, and debt is politics. This is the reality that we are facing. COVID-19 has brought about a reckoning in Anglo-America, the US and UK in particular, for decades-long dependence on debt to drive growth, and also to kind of drive growth on the one hand of debt amongst an ever-growing levels of income. More and more people. It's not just the poor that suffer from debt. Many middle class families are over leveraged. Housing has become more expensive. Student debts, credit cards, is all the different types of debt products that households owe. They've become dependent on debt. The government has become dependent on central banks expanding their balance sheet, using government debt to prop up the asset economy. And finance is the driver here. So the debt of the many, is the assets of the few, to kind of borrow John's phrasing. It's really important, in light of those spending review, to, of course, make the point that public debt and private debt are not the same thing. This kind of economic language and the power that economics has to frame what are essentially political choices into market imperatives. The language of public and private debt and the metaphors around the household, are very powerful. But public and private debt are not the same thing. But in the same breath, you must acknowledge that public and private debt are bound together, especially under financialization, but especially since the global financial crisis. With these new monetary policy, private and public debt are bound together in a boom, bust, bailout, austerity, doom loop, and we find ourselves again at the precipice of another bust and bailouts and austerity to come. So the recovery from COVID-19, we need to focus on, and I've just done a podcast on my book, and the argument in there about breaking this cycle by using debt cancellation as part of a broader package of financial reforms. And key to that, the key idea I want to hone in on is using and making credit a public good. At the moment, credit is a public good, but only for those institutions powerful enough to access trading in the discount window, whether that's for treasuries or gilts. those big banks that are able to access government bonds directly from the central bank, they get negative real interest rates. Those that benefit from asset buybacks from the central bank. These are questions of power, but we can use those measures. They exist already. Finance is just a series of legal contracts and statutes and regulations. Monetary measures already exist to allow us to use debt cancellation as part of a broader package of reform to deliver households debt relief. And not just in a small and targeted way, but in a mass way, because financialization and indebtedness has become a mass issue for most people. There are, of course, many people that struggle and go and seek citizens' advice, but there are also what we call debt drones. I know that doesn't make much sense in everyday language, but those people that work only to service their debts, 20, 25, 30% of monthly income is going towards debt repayment, and that's directly into the financial sector as very lucrative revenue. So debt is big business. So some people's debts are a very few number of people's assets. And we can use these monetary measures and re-engineer them in order to deliver a bailout at the household level. So how can this be done? Well, one easy way is to scale up the strike debt rolling Jubilee model that Astra was, I believe, part of. And that means taking non-performing loans, those loans that are already in distress, already been written off by the lender, already being pushed off their balance sheet, for which lenders get a tax break, I might add, and instead buying those up as distressed assets to clean the balance sheet of households and just canceling that debt. So we see this example as well in Croatia with the Fresh Start. This type of debt relief is especially helpful for those people that we saw in the citizens' advice, this very uneven crisis. It will help the young. You can target it in particular at payday or very high rates of lending retail credit products. So you can scale up this strike debt model by focusing on buying up non-performing loans for retail debt products. This, again, council tax arrears is another great example of how the central government can extend debt cancellation to households using a variety of mechanisms that already exist. And another really important one, before I finish, is basically restructuring, long-term restructuring, which is set up as a debt swap. Again, a commonly used monetary measure since 2010 to deliver liquidity injections to financial markets. Long-term restructuring swaps debt, high-cost retail debt, again, that households have that are much higher than the very low, historically low rates of interest that there has been for well over a decade now, that are set to only stay low. It gives households access to that. So cheap credit becomes a public good. Through these debt swaps, it would mean giving individuals access, households access to like a 0% balance transfer from the central bank, in which they would, again, still keep the principal of the loan, but they would be paying near zero interest rate. And then whatever's left after 7 years, let's say, we could look at restructuring or canceling. So there are really, existing ways that we can take right off the shelf and start pushing for and arguing for, in that language of economics, in that language of providing debt relief. And why is it important? Debt relief in this context, if we use a debt swap or debt cancellation, for non-performing loans as examples, this is just a tax cut paid for by the banks, because what it means is that the individual debtor or the household will have more of their own income to spend, save, or invest, rather than having that demand, that legal claim of a debt, for example, that's chasing them, bailiffs that are chasing them, or in the case of just paying really high rates of interest on a home equity loan, on a line of credit, on a small business loan. Again, there are lots of self-employed people on credit cards, on the bills that were outlined in the previous slides. Individuals could nominate those loans to be refinanced at a very low rate, and that would provide immediate relief for people in a very short order to be able to cope with the shock that COVID has brought economically, and allowed to look to the future, again, claim the future, and not see how am I going to pay those bills, how am I going to get back from my arrears, and instead know that I have to make this minimum payment from now for the next 7 years, and the rest I can begin to recuperate. So this is really important, and we need to use the language of economics and connect it to these common concerns that more and more people share in this time of economic suffering. So I realize I don't want to go over time, but those are my ideas, and I would love to share in the comments the podcast that I did. I'll just share the one on debt relief, but it was making this kind of broader claim in the context of COVID.
Thanks, Johnna. Thanks. Dan, who does the technical stuff for us, tell us if we can get the podcast advertised as well. That would be really helpful. If we can get it up in the comments and maybe on the main screen towards the end as well, because that will help in the discussion. Johnna, thanks a lot. I want to come back to you about the basic demand that you think we should be campaigning around. Okay, but I'll come back to you after we've heard from Astra. Look, people will know Astra Taylor. Let me do the formal introduction. Canadian-American documentary filmmaker, writer, activist, organizer, active in the Occupy movement, as people know. She was the Shuttleworth Foundation fellow. She used that to set up the Debt Collective project, which is challenging the narrative around indebtedness, particularly exposing predatory debt collection practices, which go on in both our communities. And then also how you help individuals take control of their own financial futures. So the reason we've asked Astra is because of our knowledge on debt, but also about this whole experience of the Debt Collective and how you set it up and how effective it's been as well, because it's something that I think we've got to just undertake here as well. Astra, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be here. And I just want to say how much I loved the comments from Gemma and Johanna. It was like, wow, totally on the same page. I just want to begin literally with the page. So this is the Debt Collective's new manifesto, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, the case for economic disobedience and debt abolition. Johanna's book had the word abolish debts. And so this, maybe in honor of our friend David Graeber, who was mentioned, and it was David who brought me into this work, who recruited me first into Occupy and then into the debt resistance movement. He was very clear that we should not use the language of forgiveness. That's the standard language that we hear. That we need debt forgiveness. Forgiveness implies blameworthiness, and it implies a benevolent creditor, sort of having mercy. And we don't think that debtors are blameworthy. Debt should be abolished. It's an issue of justice. People, as we say in this manifesto, people are not indebted in the United States, the same in the UK, because they live beyond their means, but because they're denied the means to live, because we're denied the public services that we would need to have a dignified and flourishing life. So this is a matter of justice, and this is a matter of taking back what belongs to us. So in the United States, I'll just give a little bit of an account of where we are here. I mean, Gemma's figures very much just could have been adjusted and applied to the United States. Even before the pandemic, household debt was at record levels, $14 trillion, staggering rates of indebtedness because people are forced to individually debt finance what should be public goods. So we are deeply indebted for medical services here, but also education, for housing. People put their necessities on credit cards and payday loans because they're underpaid. So in that sense, working people are robbed twice, right? You're underpaid at the job, and then you're forced to borrow to live, and then you have to pay fees and interest. And as John pointed out, and I think it's so important, there's a huge psychic cost to this. Debt stresses body and mind. In the US, where people fear medical debt, they do not get the treatment they need. They avoid going to doctors, avoid going to therapists because there's fear of debt. So it was a huge crisis. And now, of course, with tens of millions of jobs evaporated and no social safety net, what's going to happen? Rates of default and delinquency and despair will spiral. So what was already a crisis has just compounded. And we know for decades that what has happened is that debt has masked rising inequality, right? So easy access to credit masked the fact that wages were stagnating, masked the emergence of what we can call financialization. Basically, individuals have been forced to take on this risk for themselves. So here we are. We're in a deepening crisis. But what has happened is that because, partly I think, or in large part because of the years of organizing that the Debt Collective has done, this idea of debt cancellation is on the table and is actually being discussed in serious ways that, we might see some actual mass debt relief, especially if we keep organizing. So the pandemic, I think, has reinforced our argument that mass indebtedness is a structural problem. This is not the product of poor individual choices. There is not $1.7 trillion of student debt in the United States of America because millennials, as the media likes to say, has taste for expensive avocado toast or whatever, right? So poor people are not indebted because of poor choices. This is a structural problem. What I believe, and the Debt Collective believes, is that what we need in response to this crisis, the crisis that Joe Biden is going to be entering the White House and having to deal with, is a policy of cash to the people coupled with cancellation. We need cash payments so that people can survive through this crisis, but that has to be combined with a program of debt relief, because otherwise these cash payments are essentially a roundabout bailout of creditors. So we saw this where research now shows that people in the United States use their meager stimulus checks, over 30% of them, to service debts, right? So that money wasn't used as a stimulus. It wasn't actually spent on goods and services. It was just trying to keep the creditors at bay. And that's because of the terrible consequences that flow from delinquency. Your credit card, your credit score is destroyed, so then the cost of credit goes up. But if you default on your student loans here, you can have very serious consequences. You can have your Social Security, your retirement garnished. You can have your tax rebates garnished. You can lose your license in some states, which means you lose your job. You can actually lose your driver's license in some states, so then you couldn't get to your job. It's a very punitive system that makes people prioritize paying back debts when they actually have other incredibly urgent expenses. So the economic argument, I think we have to make moral and economic arguments for both. I recently spoke to someone for a piece and said, we have to make the growth case and the justice case for debt cancellation. And it works for every type of debt, whether here we're focusing on student debt, medical debt, mortgages, back rent, and also, but then there's the issue of municipal debt that I want to get to. But for example, with student debt, research shows that canceling all student debt, which is again 1.7 trillion now, the federal government has the ability to cancel it all. The doing so would provide a stimulus of up to $108 billion per year for at least a decade and add 1.5 million jobs to the American economy. So in other words, it wouldn't just benefit the 45 million student debtors that live in the United States. And those are people of all ages, all races. Of course, it's a problem that impacts the marginalized the most because they have the most intense debt to income ratios. The people who hold the most student debt in the United States are Black women because of because of obvious things, right? The lack of intergenerational family wealth, wage discrimination, et.cetera. So this would help far more than 45 million individual debtors. The consequences of debt cancellation would redound or reach far beyond those individuals, help their families, help the communities, and actually be a boost to the entire economy. So debt cancellation helps everyone. And you can make the same case for in slightly different ways for other kinds of debt. If people cannot pay their rent and there's a crisis of mass eviction, that seems to be where we're heading. Experts warn that 40 million Americans are at risk of eviction. Then this is going to have incredibly damaging effects for communities. I forget the name for this, but basically when people feel that they're at risk of, falling behind on their mortgage or their rent, they stop spending, right? They have a kind of freeze. So this hurts the entire economy. So this is something that we can make a broad social case for why we would all benefit from something like this. And again, the moral case from the perspective of the Debt Collective is that this is an issue of justice, and that debts for things like education, healthcare, even housing should not exist to begin with. Especially, medical debt is something that is it absolutely should not be treated like a conventional loan. It's not something that should impact your credit. Unfortunately, it really does. And it's the leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States, as Bernie Sanders was very fond of pointing out. Just 2 more points, I guess. The one thing is we have to, I think, figure out exactly what Johanna said, which is what power does the government actually possess? The Debt Collective has done a lot of research to show the government, any president with pre-existing authority can erase all student debt with basically with a signature. The Fed has immense power to fund municipalities with basically zero interest loans that municipalities could then use to pay off the debts that they currently hold to Wall Street, which right now the cities across the U.S. lose about $160 billion a year in payments to Wall Street. So this power needs to be called out, and we need to call out the double standard that exists right now. So corporate debtors always get relief. We saw this right when COVID hit, that the federal government rushed to the aid of the corporate debt market, stabilized the corporate debt market, bought a lot of bad debt from companies, including fossil fuel companies, and meanwhile basically gave these very meager pauses and moratoria on payments to regular people. But to get there, we're going to have to organize. The Debt Collective is an organization that is basically a union for debtors. We believe that, just as was said, that our debts are an asset. They're somebody else's asset. We take inspiration from the quote from Paul Getty, which is basically, if you owe the bank $1,000, the bank owns you. But if you owe the bank $100 billion, you own the bank, right? So collectively, we own the bank. Collectively, we have power. And we can engage in sort of political mobilization inspired by labor organizing, to create new kinds of solidarity, new kinds of strategies to demand the renegotiation, the abolition of odious debts, but also the provision of public services so that we're not forced into debt to survive. The last point I want to end, and I think the language of debt, one thing it obscures is that we see ourselves as guilty, as having made a mistake, as shamed, when actually we should see ourselves as creditors, as entitled to a dignified life. I think this is one of David's big, brilliant points, is that, we are actually owed the things that we need to survive and flourish. And so that's part of it's not quite a pun, but part of what's in there, in the idea of the Debt Collective, is we're going to collect on what actually belongs to us and what we need, and that our future should not be mortgaged so that a few can profit. Thank you.
Astra, thanks a lot. Really grateful. Okay, we've got some time for questions. So what I'd like to do is just throw some questions at people that people have raised with us. Johnna, if I can just come to you. If I want to talk to Astra about how we mobilize the campaign, but from you, what is the sort of demand that we should be making, or series of demands that we should be making? If we're going to mobilize people, organizations, and others, which we're going to have to, because this situation is getting to such a critical stage now, what we're going to have to do is produce a short set of demands, almost like a mini manifesto, and then rally people around that. And it's got to be in a way which people readily understand, but also in which politicians can comprehend. And it's almost like, I watched The Godfather the other night, so sorry about this. It's almost like making them an offer they can't refuse. It's that sort of thing. What do you think, Johnna?
Yeah, well, I come at it from the kind of register of economics and connecting the structural causes of poverty and the way in which debt acts as this amplifier of inequality. Because debt itself is not good or bad. It is an agent, right? So for some people, right, they see debt. Why do people take student loans? Well, because they see that they acquiesce to the idea that it's necessary for the provision of education. I don't think anybody thinks, oh, a mortgage, that means a debt until my death. I want one of those, right? What they want instead is secure housing, right? And again, look, there's nowhere else to save. Interest rates, because they've been so low, this massive subsidy to the banks. And I think we need to think about the banks as the robber barons here in this story of financialized world that we live in, right? They are these massive, extremely powerful actors that are, basically laying claim to our monthly income through a series of contracts, right? And the problems that creates on a very personal level, but structurally. So when we find those demands, they have to connect to kind of everyday senses of moral justice and moral rightness, because where debt always holds its power. And again, speaking about David Graeber and the work that it inspired, is guilt, right? Is that at some point you put your name down to that contract, and what that means, right? And all that entails. So the demands have to still always meet up against that register of kind of common sense morality. That's why I think people are much more willing to accept a lower interest rate than to say, fine, cancel all my debts. Because isn't it strange? I mean, I'd love to hear from Astra, but I always find it amazing that really, if you went down the street and said, I'll cancel all of your debts, would people say, oh yes, absolutely all of it? Or were they like, no, just a little bit? Because there's this idea that people would just grab any opportunity to be released from these obligations. But again, what you see in Citizens Advice, is that people carry these obligations many years after they have to pay them. They feel hugely responsible. The toll on them is incredible. So when we think about debt relief and the promise and that, that common sense register, people want relief. They don't they don't want to be forgiven. They'll take relief, certainly. So it's always hard for me to say, from these economic registers that don't connect with people, but we have to make that connection, because in the end, those economic registers are where power is at the moment. They control the narrative around what is acceptable debts and whose debts get canceled, right? And whose get paid. Because the reason we have these monetary measures in place is because debt cancellation is happening every day. It's just concentrated in the corporate sector. Exactly. So we just, all we want is access. We want to collect on some of that restructuring.
Before I bring Gemma in, Johnna, just remind people what happened in the banking crash and how the bad debt issue was dealt with, because people have forgotten that. It's almost as though the water's closed over it.
Yeah, when it's exactly what's going on today. They've done more in the past. They did the same amount of buying in the last 7 months of the pandemic than they did the entirety of the response to 2008. So what happens is immediately you slash interest rates, right? That sends the signal to everyone. That's what we call a whole market bailout, because everybody gets a cheap debt now, everybody who can access it. And then what you do is you take the non-performing loans of the corporate entities, their bad debts. That was the problem that the banks had. They were indebted and couldn't pay. So their debts were restructured, repackaged. Their bad assets, the toxic assets, were repurchased. So that's a troubled asset relief. They buy bad assets. So again, imagine that in an everyday term. I got a loan for a car. I got a loan for a laptop. I got a loan at the department store. The government's going to come along and buy it all off me at 30p on the pound. That's what the corporations got, just on a huge scale. Yeah. So we can, there is ways to democratize finance. Let's complete this so-called process. So it is possible, and I think that's what we need to take heart, that the technical legal jargon and mechanisms are there. We just need to be able to connect them to broader, social policy objectives as well as social justice objectives.
It's making it credible. That's the whole point, really, because people have a disbelief sometimes when we're raising these issues, and that's why pointing to what happened at the bank is quite interesting, because it happened. But it is interesting how this sort of that whole story got closed down, got very, very quickly. Gemma, what do you think in terms of the sort of demands we should be making? You've touched upon things like council tax debt in particular and rental debt. Council tax is a big one for us because a lot of people actually councils do enforce, and they're quite. I'm trying to find the right expression because they're the councils are under the cosh themselves, but they're quite then belligerent in the way that they enforce as well.
Yeah, completely. I think I'm worried about being quoted on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right that councils are the biggest users of bailiffs. So yeah, that's something that we found is particularly problematic with council tax debt, is the way that it's collected, and as I was saying earlier, the way that it escalates so quickly. So you go from missing one payment of £167 to in 2 months' time being in £2,000 of debt. But yeah, as you say, it is a difficult situation because we're in this situation where we see so many councils really struggling with funding, and so of course they need the income from the council tax and from collecting that debt. But yeah, I think it kind of, I was just reflecting on what everyone was saying, and I think there's a real strong case for supporting people who are in council tax arrears because of the kind of obvious moral points and the support for the individuals, but then you've got the councils need the money, plus then this much wider argument about the impact that debt has on consumer spending and the wider economy. I think there are so many levels on which it makes sense to the government to be addressing these debts, especially at this time.
The scale. I'll put some parliamentary questions down because it'd be interesting to know the scale of resources that are actually applied in the collection of debt by local authorities. I think it'll be quite enormous, and the way in which they're training people through the courts.
We actually have a report that I think we put out about 6 months ago, which looks exactly into how much local authorities spend on bailiffs, and how I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but that essentially the way they collect debts, it's not efficient and it's not effective. They spend so much money on bailiffs for actually very little return. So yeah, we've done the research and it's bad.
Send it to me. I'll get the figures round because it's maximum stress on everyone as well. Astra, I just want to really press you a bit. Just go through the steps that you undertook to set up the collective, and then how it operates, because I'm keen that we learn the lessons from you about what we do here.
Yes, I mean, I think the thing is that this is not about economic rationality. That's what was just pointed out in the last example, right? So incredible expense from the courts, ultimately borne by the community to collect on debtors. It's about power. Right. And when we say debt binds the future, it is about constraining people's choices, their abilities, their sense of entitlement. It's about constraining redistribution. So how do you fight power with power? The age of financialization is experienced as the age of debt, right? So financialization really can confuse people. You have to feel overwhelmed by this, discussion that seems to need a lot of expertise. It's about you being indebted for the things you need to survive. So we think as we've reorganized the economy in line with financialization, what's also happened is that there are new opportunities, new ways of organizing people that have kind of coincided with that. And again, we take inspiration from the labor movement, thinking that what we need to do is create associations to build economic power, that debtors, yes, we don't share a factory floor, but we share a creditor. And so often that creditor is the state. So again, student loans in the US are backed by the federal government. So that common creditor could be a bank. The target could be the federal government. It could be maybe a state or municipal government where you're trying to protest municipal indebtedness, or maybe try to win more consumer protections. So what we did, so the Rolling Jubilee is a project that bought medical debt was bought debt that was in collection, medical debt and tuition debt. And then nobody had ever done this before. We basically acted like debt collectors. We bought debt from debt brokers, but instead of collecting it, we abolished it, right? And then we reached out to the people whose debts we erased, and we said, this is a gift from Occupy Wall Street, from the Rolling Jubilee. This is something that then, as Johanna mentioned, could be scaled up. So, for example, Bernie Sanders made this amazing campaign proposal of buying, why wouldn't the federal government buy all of the medical debt that's in collection, $81 billion of medical debt, and then extinguish it, right? But buying debt on a secondary market is a great sort of propaganda exercise, because it gets you thinking like, oh, wow, why is this sold as an asset? Who's making money off of this? But it doesn't build power. So then what we did was we used it. We extinguished tuition debts from a predatory for-profit college, and we reached out to those debtors and we said, what you really need to do is band together in a union and go on strike. And so we launched the first ever student debt strike in 2015 with students from a predatory for-profit college, Corinthian 15. And that number multiplied. We coupled that with legal strategies using consumer protections. And we have won $1 billion, with a B, over $1 billion of debt cancellation from the federal government, proving that it can be done. Your debts actually can be erased. So I think the point is building power, finding points of demand. I think that there's something very important about calling attention to the double standard. A lot of debt does get renegotiated, it does get written off, but it is the affluent who take advantage of bankruptcy protections, it's corporate debtors. We need to say that that is happening to puncture the phony morality around debt. We also need, as organizers, to help people overcome the shame. So I think a basic thing that any debtor organizer needs to do is organize debtors' assemblies. These initial spaces where people come in a circle and they start telling their stories, or hearing stories from others, where they go, oh, other people are experiencing this. Other people can't sleep because of bills. Other people are suffering. That act of coming out and transforming something that is a source of shame and stress into a sense of indignation, entitlement, that is the first step of changing our, people's personal relationships to the debts that they hold. When you do that, then you can start saying, okay, what power do we have? What targets can there be? How can we? Maybe we won't be able to get the debts totally canceled. Maybe we could just make them uncollectible forever. Maybe we won't be able to get grants to our municipalities, but we could get zero interest loans that roll over indefinitely. What creative things can we do to break the current dynamic and to, again, just say, these debts, it's a lie that debts always have to be repaid. That is not what's happening. In the US, the problem is there's a bipartisan bias. The Democrats and the Republicans, they love to help the corporations. I mean, we've got Joe Biden, who one of his major acts as a senator was repealing the limited protections, bankruptcy protections student debtors have. He's from Delaware, the credit card capital of the world. So debtors have to take a page from the creditor's playbook, band together and start organizing. But just something as simple as those first testimonials, the first thing where you start realizing that our slogan is, you are not alone, A_LOAN, that this is a collective situation. And together we can wield our power and deny them their profits.
I like the slogan. Brilliant. Whoever thought that up was...
Take it. This is an international problem. We're all in this. We are fighting. Goldman Sachs is not just in the United States. Our cities owe so much money to Goldman Sachs. There are these conditions that we share. So yes, take our slogan as a gift, not a debt.
Definitely. There are a couple of artists who last year undertook a great project, and I've got the book here. I daren't look for it because if I move a book, everything is going to collapse. And they occupied a derelict bank in North London and had a whole series of seminars on debt, and then burnt a lot of money as a result, which was burning debt. It was wonderful. It was superb, and I just think got the message across in that one community. They had a lot of people attracted in to talk about those sorts of debts. I'll revisit them and see if we can look at how we move forward. Look, our time's up, unfortunately, and I get told off for allowing our meetings to go on forever. So, Johnna and Gemma and Astra, thanks ever so much for this. It's really helpful. Just so that people know, there was lots of questions coming in, and I'll make sure that we drop some answers back to all those people who participated. But now I think the onus is upon us, and we'll go back and talk to the various people who are involved in Claim the Future to see whether or not we can use the network now to launch the initial discussion around setting up a debt collective within this country and opening up exactly as the Claim the Future initiative is all about, the link between the development of ideas and then moving that into the discussion around a campaign and campaigners. And what I'll do is make sure we film this event. So we'll make sure we circulate the film to people so it's accessible. We'll use it at some of our other discussions too. We might edit it a bit, so cut out my ramblings, and then get the information out to people. Maybe now it's going to be we're in November, moving into December. It might well be then we do some work over the next few weeks, and then bring people together in January on a much larger basis, working with other organisations just to talk through the potential of a debt collective being launched and how we'd go about it. But it needs a lot of work on the ground I say on a larger basis, by talking to different sections of our community, trade unions, civil society organisations. But on Astra's point, it is about just bringing people together as well, about sharing their personal experiences about debt. And some people have done that in the chat that we've had today as well. I just think this is going to be the issue in the coming period as we've already got joblessness rising. We've got people under immense strain as a result of loss of income and the paucity of benefits, the appalling level of universal credit and other benefits that there are available to people. So I think it is an issue that has got to be addressed. And if we're progressive, if we're socialists, it's something that we've got to do, because otherwise people's quality of life is affected, but also that statistic about the number of people who think about suicide as a result of debt, I can't get out of my mind. Anyway, for people who've been listening, and thanks a lot for doing so. For Gemma, Johnna, and Astra, thanks ever so much. I think I found this really stimulating, and it certainly focused my mind on the action that we need to take. Okay, thanks a lot. And Dan, thanks a lot for all the administration, the technical, and Madeline Williams and Andrew Fisher and Max Harris and Ali Milani for all the work that you've been doing, bringing the Claim the Future project together and today. Thanks a lot.
We need to use this time to think. We're not going back. But where are we going? What do we want for our planet, our communities, our future? If we don't answer this question, it will be answered for us, and blame shifted from the powerful to the powerless. We need each other now. We need to reflect and reset, strategize, organize, assemble, collective power. This is a network. Join, claim the future.